My name is Razi Jafri. I am a Detroit-based documentary photographer and filmmaker.
My name is Justin Feltman. I am a Washington, D.C. based filmmaker.
I used to collect the list of graduates every year because I was really interested in the last names of the graduates, and watched that list of names shift to Bosnians in the early 90s, and then more and more Bangladeshi names and Yemeni names. And I've realized that I am probably the last in the 100-year line of Polish mayors.
Hamtramck, Michigan, has become the first Muslim-majority city in America.
Inshallah, you support me November 7th as well. Inshallah, we unify together as one, and inshallah, we accomplish the unaccomplished prior.
If you like to change, I have some idea to restructure and modify the administration.
If you care about this community and community's honor, come out and vote.
Feeling confident, feeling happy. This is our time to shine.
আমি এই চিঠিটা আমার বাড়িতে কাউন্সিল কর্তা হাসান এর নিকট থেকে পেয়েছি। তিনি লিখেছেন যে তিনি বাংলাদেশি, ইয়ামেনি, পোলিশ, আফ্রিকান আমেরিকান এবং আমেরিকানদের সাথে কাজ করেছেন। কিন্তু নির্বাচনের দিন আমরা পোলিশ আমেরিকান, আফ্রিকান আমেরিকান, ইয়ামেনি অথবা বাংলাদেশি এর কোনো ঠাই না। আমরা সবাই হলাম Hamtramck.
People didn't even think about who is being president of the United States, and tonight they want to know who will be the mayor of Hamtramck. 2 square miles.
That is the trailer for Hamtramck USA, and this is Factual America. Factual America is produced by Alamo Pictures, a production company specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for an international audience. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood, and every week we look at America through the lens of documentary filmmaking by interviewing filmmakers and experts on the American experience. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures to be the first to hear about new productions, to find out where you can see our films, and to connect with our team. The U.S. is a land of immigrants, and there's no better example of this than Hamtramck, Michigan. No bigger than 2 square miles, this city, surrounded by Detroit, is home to a myriad of nationalities and ethnic groups, and over 30 different languages can be heard on its streets. Using a city government election as a backdrop, producers and directors Justin Feltman and Razi Jafri eloquently capture the dynamism stemming from successive waves of immigration. Is America a melting pot or a mosaic? Or does it matter what we call it? We find out as we catch up with Justin and Razi from their homes in Washington, D.C. and Hamtramck, Michigan. Justin Feltman and Razi Jafri, welcome to Factual America. It's good to finally meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I think we were supposed to get together at South by Southwest in March, but obviously that never happened. I think we didn't really even have an idea what we were getting ourselves into back then. But how are you doing? I'll start with Razi.
I'm doing really well. Considering the circumstances, Justin and I are busy with new projects, and we've been working on a couple things that we have going on with Hamtramck in terms of educational partnerships. I'm doing pretty good.
Okay, and everything's okay in Detroit? I mean, I know Detroit was a bit of an mini epicenter, I guess, there a few months ago, but...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Detroit being one of the poorest cities in America and one of the blackest, the blackest large city in the United States, it was affected disproportionately, more than even the surrounding areas. So we were hit really hard with the coronavirus.
And Justin, how are things in Washington D.C.? I think you've got different types of storms there, but
Yeah, no, things are going pretty well. As Razi said, it's a good time to kind of work on our next projects. Not a good time to shoot projects, but a great time to lay the groundwork for future projects. That's kind of what's been keeping us busy. And
well, excellent. Well, I look forward to talking about some of those future projects later on the podcast. But let's talk about the film that brings you here, and the one that we were going to discuss and was actually supposed to premiere at South by Southwest. That's Hamtramck USA. Razi, where can we see this film, or has it been released yet?
It has not been released yet. We're sort of still exploring distribution options for the film. The film is screening virtually at several film festivals. Most recently, the DOXA International Documentary Festival in Vancouver, and the Melbourne International Documentary Festival in Australia. They had virtual screenings. They were geo-locked, so unless you lived in British Columbia or Australia, you wouldn't be able to see it. And then we're shooting for early next year for a public television broadcast.
Well, I had this one down for Justin because I wasn't sure exactly where everyone was from. I was going to ask you maybe, first of all, we've seen our listeners have heard, or we've got a few people on YouTube who've watched the trailer. So it's called Hamtramck USA again. I was going to ask you to tell us something about Hamtramck, or would Razi, being the Detroit-based filmmaker, rather take that one?
Yeah, Razi currently lives in Hamtramck, so if he wants to tackle this one, that might be a
So tell us, let the world know something about Hamtramck.
Hamtramck is a very special place. There was a really incredible article a couple of years ago in the Detroit Free Press that described Hamtramck as Michigan's Ellis Island. That was the headline from the article in the Detroit Free Press. And it couldn't be more fitting because it's a community that has always accepted immigrants and refugees when they're arriving to the United States. And just to kind of give a sense of the geography of where Hamtramck is in the region and in the country, Hamtramck is in the state of Michigan. It's actually inside Detroit. Detroit is big enough where it actually has two other cities inside of its boundaries, Hamtramck being one of them, Highland Park being the other one. And for most of its history, Hamtramck was a majority Eastern European city, predominantly Polish American, Hungarian, Ukrainian people occupied the city. And then over the last 25 to 30 years, the demographics really started shifting in Hamtramck, and you had more people arriving to the city from places like Bangladesh and Yemen. And then you also have people moving to Hamtramck from places like Queens in New York. And so you've seen this influx of in-migration from people from various different backgrounds. And so the demographics of the city have totally shifted from Eastern European to South Asian and Middle Eastern. And so now Hamtramck's, I guess one of its claims to fame is that it's America's first Muslim majority city.
And what does that mean, that it's the first Muslim majority city at Razi?
Well, I think in today's sort of political climate, it means a lot in the sense that, Muslims are one of the more marginalized and misunderstood religious communities in the United States. And so what does it mean when Muslims are residents of a community in a majority fashion? And on the other side, it really doesn't mean anything. In the sense that, democracy and life in Hamtramck is no different than what life and democracy would be like in any other working class town in America. Because the common issues, for the communities of Hamtramck are issues around class, schools, safety, potholes, things like that. And so I think both things are worth noting, that it's both remarkable and unremarkable in that regard.
I think that's well summarized. And maybe I could take us to Justin, because Justin, maybe you can, for our listeners again, who most will have not seen the film, maybe you can give us a synopsis of what this film's about.
Yeah, the film kind of covers life and democracy in America's first Muslim majority city, Hamtramck, Michigan. When we started working on the film, we knew the election would be a central kind of driving from a narrative standpoint. But we also knew that what really makes this place special is the daily contributions and creation of the community that goes beyond just voting. There's many ways of contributing to the city, and we wanted to make sure that we included all of those. There's a lot of, slice of life kind of montages, whether that's, religious life, so churches, mosques, or with the arts. So there's, performances, arts and crafts kind of fairs, and then just cultural celebrations. It seems like every weekend there's at least 4 events happening in this tiny little 2 square mile town, 2 square miles. And, I think that that's what makes this place special, as Razi kind of was saying, is part of it's very unremarkable, but there is something very remarkable in that as well. A lot of it, for instance, one of their biggest celebrations is a Labor Day parade. And, it may look a little different, but it still hits the same notes that any other Labor Day parade has.
But I think, and maybe this won't sell the film, but both of you have touched on this, is some of the elements that are so unremarkable about
Right.
Hamtramck, what you capture with your film. It is everyday life, and this election that you've focused on. I mean, Justin, it was that you said that it's obviously a narrative driver, but when you went to make this film, did you think, no, we're definitely making it about this election, or was it more about we're making a film about Hamtramck?
Yeah, I think we wanted to find. Well, Razi and I had met during the 2016 election. I was in town working on a documentary found like marginalized voices in American democracy. And after the results came in, Razi and I were looking for a project to work on together. And for us, we knew Hamtramck would be where we wanted to be and would be where we wanted to go. Sorry. And when we were looking for that narrative, the election was coming up for mayor. The previous election had gotten them the first Muslim majority city council. And so we figured, well, this would probably be a historically significant election. Let's cover this one. So it wasn't our immediate, it wasn't necessarily what we wanted to tell, but I think it made the most sense. And it made a lot of sense to include that. And, as we covered it, we knew that this was the important thread to really kind of bring the town all together. And, especially post 2016, what does democracy look like? What does true representation look like? And those are themes that, we hope to tell throughout the film.
And we'll try not to give away. We won't give away too much about the film, obviously. But Razi, maybe you can set the scene in terms of this election. Justin's already made mention that it's a mayoral and a city council election, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, and I think there's a couple things that I can sort of touch on, as leading into my answer, and so, I was mentioning before how the demographics of the town had really shifted, and so there were these seminal moments in Hamtramck's history, with plant closures and sort of both economic and cultural milestones and significant events that took place, in the city, and with, plant closures sort of driving some of the demographic shifts, when you have these new communities coming in and establishing new neighborhoods that were often left vacant by the egressing Polish community or the existing community that was already there. Then as things, continue to grow and proliferate amongst these minority communities that are newer, that are coming into Hamtramck, they're making more and more cultural inroads into the city through cultural representation and through representation in politics. And so I think it was in 2004 when there was a controversy brewing around the Muslim call to prayer being broadcast on loudspeakers throughout the city of Hamtramck. And so this is, obviously, 13, 14 years before our film takes place. But, these are kind of some of the things that are starting to develop and starting to take place in Hamtramck leading up, to the election. And then in 2013 was when the city council becomes a majority Muslim city council. And it's comprised of, members of the Bangladeshi community, but also members of the Yemeni community. And so that kind of leads us into the current period where Hamtramck finds itself under emergency financial management. It's economically distressed. It's a working class, impoverished community. That's in a way united by class. And so that's a little bit of the backdrop, And then, of course, we have the greater political climate that's taking place in the United States that through the 2016 presidential election that Justin was alluding to, at least by the candidate at the time, Donald Trump, was based on a largely anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, campaign. And so a place like Hamtramck, which is majority Muslim, majority immigrant town, creates an amazing backstory for a way to tell the story of a changing America. And so that's kind of what some of the lenses that we were looking at, and why Hamtramck was so appealing. In terms of anything particular about that year, I would say that there was nothing really particularly special, about the year, 2017, other than it being on the heels of the 2016 election. And it's sort of a shift, but it's a shift that's a part of like a 10-year, 5-year shift in the political change that's taking place in Hamtramck through more and more representation through City Hall. And so that's kind of the context behind, the years leading up to the year that we shot our film.
And so you've got this, the sitting mayor is Karen Majewski, who's of the Polish community, and she's quite eloquent, isn't she, about her place in history, isn't she? She's very well aware. I mean, I'm not giving away anything too much if I say she says, I know I'm the last in the line of Polish mayors in this town, and then you've got the two challengers, both are Muslims. Are they both from the Bangladeshi community, or are they
Kamal and Hassan? Yes. Yeah.
And then you've got the fellow, and then I think you focus. You've got many characters, like any good doc, Scott. But you've got especially this guy Fidel Al Marsoumi, I think, who's the going for a council and from the Yemeni community, and he's a very interesting fellow too. I think there's quite a cast of. We say cast of characters usually sometimes wrongly, meaning zany or whatever, but they're a very compelling bunch of people. Yeah. I think. What struck me, many things have struck me about this film, and thank you so much for the screener. Justin, how did you gain so much access? You guys were there for a long time, weren't you? Because you start off summer, you got the primary in August, and you take it all the way to November of that year. Right. So how'd you gain all that access, and how receptive were people to you filming?
Yeah, we actually started pretty much that same week that Trump got elected. When I talked to Razi about the idea, we both were like, we need to film this Hamtramck election. And so I just left my film gear with him. I said, start shooting. I'll move up there in a couple months and I'll see you soon. It kind of was during that time still coming up as much as possible, probably at least twice or 3 times a month. And then finally moved up there. And yeah, I think the big part of why people were so receptive is because we were always around. We showed genuine interest. And I think they also appreciated that we weren't trying to sensationalize what was going on there. I think they're used to a lot of people kind of drop it in for a weekend or a day or something and really trying to make like a very sensational story, a kind of clash of the civilizations kind of thing. And that was never of an interest to us. And I think, we invested enough time that I think that they grew to kind of appreciate what we were trying to do. And I also would say that Hamtramck's a very welcoming town. people are genuinely open in ways that never cease to amaze us.
I don't know I don't know which ones or you both were holding cameras, but did I catch in one scene one of the people tried to give you a hug?
Yes, that was me.
Well, I'll leave it there, but I thought it was very touching. It was like the guys like, "Oh, come on, you're just going to keep rolling, or you're going to let me give you a hug, or something to that effect." It was
we developed really great relationships with people, and I think part of it was Justin and I showing up without the cameras often, and spending time with people and their places of business and their homes and social events. And Justin, I think moving to Hamtramck was a big deal, for 6 months of production. I eventually also moved to Hamtramck. I live there now. And I think so much of that access was because, of the trust that we were able to build up by showing up and asking good questions and spending time with people. And I think that was a big part of it.
And I think you've already touched on this a bit, but question often asked is it's about Hamtramck, it's about this election. Certainly that drives the narrative. But Razi, what is this film really about?
Well, I mean, I think, there's a great, Hamtramck is a great case study. Our nation is changing. Our demographics are changing very quickly. And, there's a lot to be learned from places like Hamtramck, because it's not the only city that looks like this or has had its demographics shifted so quickly. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Hamtramck's achievements and its failures. And for us, I think right now, in this particularly tumultuous time in our history, both because of the coronavirus and police brutality and racial profiling and some of the other racial tensions that we're seeing in our country, we have to ask ourselves some really deep questions. What kind of a nation are we looking forward, knowing that our country is changing? And do we embrace pluralism, and do we embrace multiculturalism, or shall we remain divided or continue to remain divided? Obviously Justin and I have a particular, take on that issue. And so what we're trying to show is how can communities work together in the United States? And it's not just even the United States. The demographics are shifting all over the world. And you see the rise of nationalism in not only Europe, but also in Asia and South Asia and East Asia. So how is it that humanity is going to reconcile our different relationships that we have with our communities that live, in our nations as neighbors, as members of our community, as new members of our communities? And I think, we have a broad appeal with our film because it touches on a lot of these things. There's also a lot of international connections through things like the conflicts of the geopolitics and conflicts of the modern Middle East. Hamtramck has welcomed a lot of refugees from places like Iraq, Syria, and Yemen over the last 10 years as this crisis has been unfolding internationally. And so as people get resettled in places like Germany and the United States, what is that going to look like? Are we going to embrace people? Are we going to segregate people? These are all questions that we explore and examine and touch upon in our film. So therefore, there is this universal lesson there for everybody.
I think this takes us to a good point to actually watch or listen to a clip from the film that you've gracefully provided us with. I think if maybe, Justin, you can give us a bit of an introduction here. This is, we've already been introduced to the Hamtramck through the trailer and to Mayor Karen Majewski, but this gives us a little bit more of a feel for one of the other mayoral candidates and sort of an homage, really, to Hamtramck.
Yeah. In the film, this is actually right after a kind of montage of news footage that is kind of putting out scare tactics, I would say would be fair, about what Hamtramck is like. And so we're going from this and then diving into a candidate who's running for Mayor Kamal Rahman. And it's him with his family in a very everyday kind of setting. And he's talking about why he's getting involved and what kind of he feels he wants for Hamtramck. And then we're going into kind of daily life in the city.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's listen to that clip, and we'll be providing you, our listeners, with a break, and we'll then welcome you back to Factual America. You're listening to Factual America. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Alamo Pictures to keep up to date with new releases or upcoming shows. Check out the show notes to learn more about the program, our guests, and the team behind the production. Now back to Factual America.
I came here with my family in 1986. I went to school, Hamtramck High School. City is in need of a change. We have a mayor there for 12 years. I am running for mayor, and this is the first time I'll be running for any elected office.
Just to the right behind me, a little bit behind me, that's it. Allahu Akbar.
Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with Justin Feltman and Razi Jafri, the directors and producers of Hamtramck USA. I think I want to talk a little bit more about the project and the actual filming at this point, if I may. And that was a lovely clip that I think really showcases what the film's about. I think we've already talked about how you guys kind of got involved. Justin, well, you actually moved to Hamtramck. I know you did too, Razi. But what did you expect to find, Justin? Maybe this goes back to before 2016 or when you first encountered Hamtramck. And follow-up questions, which I'll put to you now, as part you can answer them as part of your responses. Is Hamtramck really this idyllic in some ways? And is it in some ways too good to be true? But I pose that to you. What do you think?
I think when I first was coming there, I knew Hamtramck from the footage we had seen on the news. And that gives you a very negative and tensions kind of running high at all points kind of feel for the city. And I didn't find that there when we actually got there. I would say, is it really that idyllic? Maybe not. But I do think there's an honest soul searching going on in that city right now amongst a lot of leaders, a lot of community leaders, and a lot of activists that are really trying to make a better future. Really trying to apply some of the lessons learned. That it is in some ways, as Razi was speaking of earlier, many communities are going through something similar. And so we kind of wanted to show that soul searching a bit in Hamtramck. We really wanted to put that first and foremost.
And I think, isn't this really sort of the history of the United States? I mean, you've had waves and waves of immigrants. So the Irish came, and then the Italian wave came in and didn't push them out, but they were the next ones to come in. And then you get a Puerto Rican wave, and you get all these different waves of immigrants to certainly certain urban locales. And it just seems to me how it spoke to me was like I felt like I was watching. It would have been great if you guys could go back in time and film New York in the 1890s and different time periods in the U.S. where you had these waves of immigration.
Yeah, there was this interesting article that we found in some Chicago newspaper where it kind of talked about Hamtramck, and I think it was in the 30s, and they called it like a Polish no-go zone, basically, that if you don't speak Polish, you're not allowed into the city limits, basically, and it's complete anarchy, and it's all these scare tactics. They're like, oh, this rhymes.
Exactly. I mean, Razi, what lessons do you want viewers to take away once they finally get to see this film?
Well, I think, one of the, some of the big things that we want people to take away from the film is just more of a nuanced understanding of, immigrant communities and their sense of the sense of responsibility that a lot of immigrant communities feel about civic engagement and democracy. One of the things that I think is often falsely, a lot of these communities are falsely accused of is that they only care about themselves. And I think one of the examples that you learn from the film is how engaged the candidates are in communities that are outside of their own. Not just, people like, Kamal and Muhammad and Fadl, but also people like Karen, who's a white Polish, person, and a woman, and she's in a very savvy way connecting to all these other communities. And I think, one of the big things you realize is that the people that are running for office in these places, they also care about, clean roads and, public safety and better schools and clean water and things like that. Some of these issues that are regional issues or universal issues around the country. And so I think that's one of the big takeaways is that, immigrants are not just here to take advantage of the benefits of living in the United States. They actually give back in ways that, more ways often than American-born, citizens do. And so I think that's like one of the big takeaways. And the other thing is to sort of understand the innocuous nature of what some of these communities, what life is like in some of these communities, And that's the thing about whether this Hamtramck is a remarkable place, an idyllic place, or is it an unremarkable place? Well, it's really kind of both, And so I think that's another thing where there's a hypercharged lens on Hamtramck, particularly through the media, and I'll just, Fox News has a particular lens on Hamtramck because it is, first Muslim majority city. And in a way, Muslims are, occupying the major leadership roles in the city. And if Islam is one of the more toxic ideologies that the way that people perceive it to be, then what does it look like when Muslims are engaging in the political process? And so these are critical questions to sort of think about and lessons to take away from in the film.
I think it's a good point. I think how many times does one of the candidates talk about cheap water and clean, make sure your streets are clean and your potholes are filled and things like that. Right. It's grassroots politics as it's been in the US for as long as anyone can remember, I think. Justin, are you the sound guy, I think, or it doesn't have to be? There's a tolling bell motif that I picked up in the film.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little something about that?
Yeah, well, that, Hamtramck religion really is out loud. You hear the St. Florian, which is a Catholic church. It is the largest building or tallest building in Hamtramck. And so you can, throughout the city, hear the bells. And they are, Razi, correct me if I'm wrong, there's 8 mosques in Hamtramck?
I think there's about 12 now, yeah.
Oh, 12, okay. And, so you hear the call of prayer daily as well. And then it's this it really kind of blends into the urban soundscape really beautifully. And sometimes, we'd just be filming regular things and you kind of hear both going off around the same time. And so it was always kind of there, kind of constantly, whether we wanted it to be a motif or not. It certainly makes its way into the film. And so, we just really embrace that.
With many documentary films, you're sort of straddling the intersections of ethnography and journalism and documentary filmmaking. And so I think that's a part of us that was really interested in the sort of the sensory experience of Hamtramck. And I think, Justin and I tried to capture some of those moments of the sights, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, bumping up against people, the celebrations. And, those are definitely things that we wanted to lift out. And I think the more time we spent in the city, the more acutely attuned we became to some of those elements, some of those sensory elements that we were experiencing that ended up, making it into the film.
The buildings in Hamtramck, especially the homes, were kind of put up in a hurry along the boom of the auto industry. And so they're very thin walls and they're maximize the lot. So you're always right bumping up next to each other. So it's always present in your life as any sounds outside. And you know, there's also a lot of music venues. So you hear music, you hear religious ceremonies or you know, call to prayers or the bells. So it's all these things that, as Razi's saying, is really about the sensory experience of Hamtramck. And so we really wanted to kind of let that play throughout the film. And, you know, a lot of these kind of scenes kind of bump in together because it's just kind of, you're always in Hamtramck. There's no escaping it when you're in Hamtramck.
You know, that's an interesting point you raised, because one thing I kept thinking of, because I used to live in a town just outside Boston, Massachusetts, where the housing was very similar, except stacked them higher a little bit. But you felt like if you put your hand out the window, you would touch your neighbors in the house next door. I mean, it was that, you know, I think I think the mayor talks about these 30-foot square lots or something like that, you know. I mean, you were on that point that you were mentioning, Razi. I just had a question, is that do you think one thing that if you look at the history of Poland and Polish and then these people from the Middle East and the South Asians that have come, do you think that one thing that helps here is that, at least even culturally, these are people of faith, or maybe as Muslims would say, they're all people of the book? I mean, it's kind of a, do you think that is an element, that there's a sort of a commonality there that helps with this engagement?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think as communities become more comfortable with each other, it does help. However, I think it's a source of tension, particularly in the early periods, you know, when these communities don't really know one another. And so I think that's where you get some of the tension. And, you know, and we do sort of touch on that a little bit in the film, particularly around issues like the call to prayer. So I think initially it's always this sort of point of tension. And then as time goes on, it does become something sort of bond over. And, you know, one of the things that we show is how different candidates will go to the different houses of worship in the community. You know, Karen goes to mosques and Kamal goes to churches. And so, you know, I think a lot of it just has to do with time, you know. But I think religion is deeply, deeply important for people, you know, from Poland as Polish Catholic, you know, from people from Yemen and Bangladesh. These are deeply religious countries and so they carry those traditions with them. And religion is very visible in Hamtramck, you know, as Justin was saying, through the sounds, but through the architecture, through the design, through the, you know, sort of urban vernaculars that you see just kind of every day on the streets, clothing, you know, all that stuff. It's a lot of it is expressing religious life in the city.
One last question on this part of the podcast for both of you. So melting pot or mosaic? What is the United States? Justin, you go next.
I think the melting pot, you know, implies that things kind of melt down into a monoculture. And I think there's some that would prefer that, but I don't think that's I wouldn't personally prefer it, and I don't think it's a very realistic statement either, because, I mean, I believe, you know, if that was, well, that's not the case for a lot of people, correct? Like, I mean, you know, it's the myth of the model minority is that, you know, that they would be able to melt down and fit in, but that's never the case. And so I think, you know, more the mosaic would be more of something we should be striving for. And because, you know, everyone plays a beautiful part and you know, celebrating differences and different perspectives is, I think, a much better way of building a multicultural society.
And what do you think, Razi?
Well, I mean, you know, there's sort of two takes on it. Like you're saying, there's the sort of melting pot, and today more and more, I think thought leaders on the topic think of America as a salad bowl, or would like to think of America as a salad bowl, where you have separate pieces, you know, but they're part of the same, you know, dish. And I think it's interesting when you think about things like culinary traditions, like what is American food, and it's a mishmash of all these different culinary traditions, borrowed, stolen, appropriated, mixed and matched, and fused with other things. And I think one of the great things about America is that it is a type of a multicultural experiment. I mean, we really haven't seen this, and it's being experienced in other parts of the world as well, and particularly in Western and Northern Europe. But you don't see it anywhere more than you see it in the United States. And a lot of it has to do with liberal immigration policies of the 1960s, where you've had a boom of people coming in from all over. And you sort of break it down to interpersonal relationships and marriages and things like that, and how families are developing and growing. We're less segregated in a lot of ways. We're still highly, highly segregated, particularly in metropolitan areas. But you're seeing a lot more intermarriage. You're seeing a lot more desire for people to want to know about each other's cultures. I agree with Justin. I mean, I would like to see more celebration of different cultures in the type of a mosaic landscape. As more, as our country becomes more diverse, I think it would be kind of a loss if we all sort of melted into a monoculture. And I think that's one of the great things to celebrate about America, is that we have all these different things. And sort of to bring it back into Hamtramck's experience, if you were to sort of take a year of Hamtramck's life through festivals, you have the, Punchki Day, Fat Tuesday before the start of Lent, where now the majority of people that are lining up, to get these donuts, these oversized Punchki donuts, are non-Polish. And on that day, everybody is Polish, and then people really celebrate that, and then there's the Eid holidays and the Eid festivals that take place in Hamtramck, where, of course, you have a lot of Muslims that are coming out, but when there's a big carnival that's celebrating this holiday, all kinds of kids are going to come. If you look at a place like Hamtramck High School, which has like 35 or 37 official languages, it's really incredible to see that taking place on a grassroots level. And so my hope is that, we'll continue to celebrate this diversity in a way that recognizes our differences and celebrates the differences, but also makes us stronger and more culturally literate, which I think is one of the ways we become a more peaceful society.
I'll let you have the last word on that one. I think what I would like to talk about, it's maybe not as uplifting, but just to talk about your own experiences now with the film world turned upside down. And Justin, as we talked about earlier, you're supposed to have the world premiere at South by Southwest. That didn't happen. I think Razi's already said that you've then had some been shown at a couple of film festivals. But what's happened over the last 4 months for you in terms of this film, and where are things headed with Hamtramck USA?
Well, I would say the one thing that we're looking forward to, that we've done a few educational screenings, and I think those have gone really well from a remote standpoint. And I think, as it seems like every day a new major college is announcing they're going online for next year, I think this is a great opportunity for documentaries to kind of lead curriculum in many ways. It makes for a great remote study, and I think that's that's a big focus that we're working on right now. We've gotten an impact grant to kind of start this, and that's one of the positives that's really come out of this so far, that I think we're really looking forward to going forward as well.
That's an interesting point. Actually, in the early days of this podcast, we had a lot of academics come on, and what was always interesting was all of them have their favorite go-to documentaries that they use as part of their lectures. I mean, it's in fact, I was introduced to documentaries I was not aware of because of these people. Like, no, we show this one every year, and it works, and this is why it works, and on so many different subjects. So, no, I think that's an important point. But Razi, I mean, in terms of the maybe documentary film industry, how do you see the landscape changing? Is COVID, is there still room for festivals? I mean, I asked this question of other filmmakers, and I seem to get a different answer each time. So be interesting to see what you think.
Well, I think you're probably getting different answers every time because the honest answer is no one knows. Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know what to say, to that. Other than kind of what we're seeing right now is that, the situation keeps getting extended, further and further. And so a lot of festivals that we were a part of and other festivals that, that we're not a part of are, have rescheduled the festivals till November and December, as anticipating that things might get better by then. But, now we're starting to feel like that's not going to be a possibility. And so, yeah, I mean, the short answer is we don't know. And I think, it's shut down production for so many filmmakers on projects that they were working on. And then, the funding cycles have also been affected by this as well. Nonprofits and foundations have been affected by it. And so I think a lot of us are sort of trying to scramble to figure out what's next and how to adjust, and how to work on projects when your ability to shoot is so limited. And, that's the heart of a film, is your time with your subjects and your time documenting and capturing those moments. That'll eventually become the lifeblood of any film. And so when you can't do that, it makes it really challenging.
And you've already sort of alluded to it. What is next for the two of you?
Yeah, well, Justin and I are, we're collaborating on a film together. I have a film that I'm producing. It's a documentary called Loyalty, which explores the life and work of 3 Muslim chaplains as they navigate religious freedom and Islamophobia in the military. And that film is at about 80%, 90% production is completed. We had one scene to shoot, which was going to be in Mecca, as 2 of our subjects were going to be performing the Hajj pilgrimage, but that's indefinitely on hold now. But in the meantime, Justin and I have also been working on a new film, which is about the life and work of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the first U.S. citizen since the Civil War to have been hunted and killed extrajudicially by the U.S. government in 2011. And so the film explores how Anwar al-Awlaki became radicalized against the United States, and how the United States became radicalized against Anwar al-Awlaki and Islam vis-a-vis the war on terror. And so the film sort of explores these things through the war on terror, the proliferation of the drone programs, and sort of, and so we're looking at this through an archival project. And so we're working with an archival producer. And so that's where we are with the project right now. We're in a research phase. We've been reading books on it and articles, and just gathering as much information as we can on it.
Well, look forward to seeing that. Justin, do you have any?
I mean, I'm working on a couple shorter films. One on a kind of the U.S.'s response to venereal diseases in the early 20th century during World War I. They saw it as a national security issue that ended up imprisoning thousands of women, and so we're kind of examining that kind of approach, and kind of how sexism and classism really kind of played into that as well. And then I'm also tomorrow actually going to West Virginia to go film some greyhound racing, and working on a project, because Florida, this is the last year of greyhound racing in Florida, and there's a guy a trainer that moved up to West Virginia to keep employment. So kind of working on that project as well.
Well, when you get these all done, you'll have to let us know, and we'll having you on again. I want to take this back to the film, because actually it's hard to believe, but we're kind of coming up on time. But I wanted to ask both of you, because I have a feeling I won't suppose I know what you're going to say, but I'm just curious, having now seen Hamtramck, and ask you, who are your main influences as documentary filmmakers?
I would say one of my big influences is Steve James from Chicago. I love and admire his work, and I've been lucky enough to have met Steve on a couple of occasions, and he's just such a nice guy. He's so down to earth. Yeah.
I mean, I hate to say this, but yeah, same. I really like Steve James's work. He has a very empathic approach to filmmaking that I think we really hope to kind of bring to our filmmaking as well. And, I think his work's great.
I will say, I mean, I went way back, but I'm also older. But just watching this, I thought back to the classic Primary. Back all the way, I thought about Pennebaker. I thought of The Maisels. I thought of Salesman. I mean, this is. I mean, if you don't mind me saying, I think it's great direct cinema that you've got here with just.
Thank you.
You just
so much.
You just let the cameras roll, and you don't even realize you're doing it. It wasn't until later. I was like, wait a minute, I've just watched. I wasn't even thinking in these terms. It was just it being entertained, but it has that feel to it, and I do appreciate it.
Well, that's high praise. Thank you so much.
well, no, it's meant. It's sincere. I tell you.
Thank you.
Well, fortunately, we're going to have to wrap up. But Justin and Razi, it's been a pleasure having you on Factual America. We look forward to having you again if we haven't scared you away. And just to remind our listeners out there that Justin Feltman and Razi Jafri are the directors and producers of Hamtramck USA. Where you can follow them. We'll have notes and links in the show notes, and we'll be on the lookout for when this finally gets distributed to a wider audience. Please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. And this is Factual America, signing off. You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.